Hello my friends, welcome to another Deck Tech with Dave. I am your host Alkadron. I'm going to jump right into it. This time we are talking about my girlfriend, Sir Carah the Bold. The girlfriend thing is a joke. I call Arumi my wife. It's very funny, trust me. Sir Carah the Bold is absolutely far and away my favorite of the... let me see if I can block the glare. My favorite of the Knights cycle from Eldraine. Some of them were really incredible. Some of them were really gross. Some of them were boomers. Sir Carah is, I think, easily the most fun. She is a 5-mana 3/3. She can tap to deal 1 damage to any target, which is incredibly relevant. She's going to deal some damage to some players. She can kill mana dorks. It's super important. What is also extra very critically important and what makes her the best and the most fun of the Knights, I think, is whenever she or an instant or sorcery I control deals damage to a player, I get to impulse draw the top card of my library and I can play that card this turn. So as long as you have burn in your deck, she's going to turn all of your burn spells into draw spells, and that's crazy. There's going to be so much... You can get these incredible crazy turns where you play a couple burn spells and you impulse draw a bunch of cards, and some of those give you mana, and you play the Mana Geyser or the Seething Song and you get more mana, and the rest of them are burned, and you play those and they just impulse draw you more cards, and it just sort of like chains into itself until you run out of mana, and it can get out of hand really quickly. So I have an enormous amount of fun with her. I'm going to tell you a little bit how I built her. I should also mention that I first built her when Eldraine came out, and at the time a card called Dragon's Approach did not exist. So this deck has changed dramatically in the last year because of this guy right here. Dragon's Approach was an absolute game changer for us. This is a 3-mana sorcery. It deals 3 damage to each opponent. If we stop right there, we have an incredible card. With Carah in play, this is going to deal 3 damage to each of 3 opponents. So you're dealing 9 total damage for 3 mana, and then you're drawing 3 cards. This is an Ancestral Recall stapled to a 10-mana Fireball, all for just 3 mana. So let's keep reading, because despite all of that, it gets better. As this card resolves, you can exile it and 4 other copies of it. To search your library for a dragon creature card, put it straight onto the battlefield and then shuffle. Normally, exiling multiple copies of the same card is not going to work in EDH, because you can only have 1. But a deck can have any number of cards named Dragon's Approach. So here's 13 cards of my deck. They're all Dragon's Approach. Always has been. That's not true. This deck was very different a year ago. Since Dragon's Approach got printed, I put 13 in the deck. 13 was my original plan. The deck still does want to do other things. It's important. Like your mana bursts aren't always going to come in multiples of 3, so it's important that you have a bunch of 1 and 2 mana spells that you can use that spare mana up, not let it go to waste. The deck also needs a handful of cards that deal damage to creatures, because that's important. I think that 13 is probably the right number for now, considering what the rest of the deck is doing, but we can adjust that up or down as necessary. So we got 13 of these bad boys. It's unlikely that you're never going to get this put a dragon into play trigger twice in one game. If you're doing this twice, that means you've hit 10 of the Dragon's Approaches, which is really unlikely. Also, hitting 10 of them means that you have dealt 30 damage to each opponent. So probably the game is over by that point. Probably the game is over long before then in a burn deck that's this dedicated. But you're probably going to hit 1. You're almost always going to hit 1 Dragon's Approach here. And so, I mean, and by one, I mean one cast trigger where you exile 5 of them and put a dragon into play. So, to make that happen, we have a couple dragons in the deck. The first dragon that we're going to put into play with Dragon's Approach, the number one choice that we should always go for if it's available is Rapacious Dragon. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2 treasure tokens. That's basically all this does. It's a 3/3 flying body, which is fine. It's not bad. It's not exciting, but it's tolerable. But more importantly, this is half of a Black Lotus. For free for dealing 15 damage to people. It's very exciting. This deck is super unreasonably crazy mana hungry. We need those treasures. Like, we just main deck Lotus Pedal because free mana is incredibly important. So this card being 2 free mana is going to help us out a lot. This card might not always be available in your deck to hit with Dragon's Approach, however. Sometimes it might be in your hand, and like you kind of don't want to cast it for 5. That's a huge mana investment for this thing. So sometimes it'll be in your hand and it won't be in your deck to get with the Dragon's Approach. Sometimes you'll just exile it with Carah, and like you won't be able to cast it because you don't have 5 mana, and it'll just stay exiled, and then it's gone forever because you can only cast those spells this turn. So if you end your turn without casting it, it just stays exiled and it's gone. If the Rapacious Dragon is not available, we have 2 backups. Backup number 1 is Furnace Whelp. It's a fire-breathing flyer. 4 mana for a 2/2 flying. You can pay red to give it power. This doesn't seem very impressive, but the point in the game at which you've cast 5 Dragon's Approaches, you can pretty safely assume that everyone is at most 15 life left. And you're probably pretty late game. You probably have 10-ish mana to pour into this thing if you want to. So this guy has evasion and is very capable of just one-shotting people, just yeeting people out of the game with a huge power, if it comes to that. Especially in a deck that's this dedicated to burn, just being able to dome someone for 10, 12 in the air. Not a bad plan. The last one is called Lightning Shrieker. You probably can't read this very well. It is a 5/5 with Flying Trample Haste, and at the beginning of your end step, you shuffle it into your library. The text here says, I killed 4 people. That this copy of this card was opened by a friend of mine at the pre-release, and I told him to take it out of his deck because it was a bad card that isn't good. But he left it in the deck, and he just killed people with it over and over again. So I was very impressed. I made him sign the card and then give it to me. And that's what's in the Carah deck. So this is fun with Dragon's Approach because you can pull it out of the deck. You can dome someone for 5 in the air with haste. It's kind of crazy. And then you shuffle it back into your deck, which is cool. So this is the dragon package. We have these 3 dragons. We have 13 Dragon's Approaches. We're probably going to reliably... We can use these to reliably hit the dragon trigger once in a game. And those are the dragons we're going to get. The rest of the deck, heavily influenced by the deck I originally built for Carah before Dragon's Approach existed. I was really focused on all of the cards I could find that could potentially give you multiple triggers off of Carah. In the same way that Dragon's Approach gives you 3 triggers, because it's hitting 3 opponents, I wanted to find the cards that are going to hit as many opponents as possible, which brings us straight to Flame Rift. You cannot go wrong with Flame Rift. This is the Pals meta staple, the original nemesis. Everyone takes 4 damage. This is 2 mana, crazy powerful burn, and also you get to impulse draw 4 cards off of this with Carah because it damages you as well. So she's gonna trigger once for each opponent. She triggers once when you damage yourself. This is drawing 4 cards. This card is ridiculous. The other card that's going to let you draw 4 at once is Reign of Embers. It doesn't hit the players as hard. It only hits for 1 damage, but it also hits each creature. So this can have a lot of utility at clearing out dorks or like wiping out saprolings or token strategies. But again, most importantly, if it hits each player, it's going to draw you 4 cards. We got a almost wannabe pseudo Reign of Embers here in the Crimson Vow set that just came out. This is End the Festivities. It is also going to deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. But it only hits opponents. So it's not going to hit your creatures, which sometimes will matter. And it's not going to hit you, which is very sad. We want these things to hit us so they deal us damage so that we can draw cards off them. But still, it's 1 mana for 1 damage to everything that's not yours, and you draw 3 cards off of Carah. This is Ancestral Recall with an upside. It's pretty bonkers. After that, the quality of our cards dries up a little bit. We have Forked Bolt. This is still pretty good. It's 1 mana for 2 damage divided as we choose. So if we split this to 2 players, we get 2 triggers off of Carah. It's also pretty fitting that Carah kind of has this like lightning thing going on. You can see her staff and the artwork is all sparkly. There's electricity arcing off it. I think her pinging ability is lightning. So I like the Forked Bolt in here. It's lightning flavored. 1 mana, draw 2 cards. Solid, we take that. Chandra's Pyrohelix and Twin Bolt are the exact same card. They're both 2 mana instants that deal 2 damage divided as you choose. So not as powerful as Forked Bolt in terms of the casting cost, but it's still going to be, we cast this card and then we draw 2 cards off of Carah. I keep on using draw. I mean impulse draw. It's close enough. Orcish Cannonade, shockingly, can get us 3 cards if you're very dedicated. For 3 mana at instant speed, it's pretty good. It's going to deal 2 damage to whatever you want, and it's going to deal 3 damage to you. So if you target a player with this, it's 2 damage to a player, that triggers Carah. It's 3 damage to your own face, that triggers Carah again, and then you draw a card, and that's your 3rd card. The thing I really love about the Cannonade is sometimes in this deck, you're not going to be able to aim your bolts and your removal and stuff at players. Sometimes you're going to have to take out creatures. And even when that happens with this, you're going to take out a creature that has 2 toughness, and you're still going to get the Carah trigger when it bolts you in the face, and you're still going to draw a card off it. So this card is very powerful in this deck. It's interesting looking at these cards because with Dragon's Approach being as powerful as it is, and being able to play any number that we want to, that's sort of the threshold that we have to balance all these cards against. Like, this is a good card, but you have to ask, is it better than Dragon's Approach? I think the answer is yes. I think its versatility makes it very powerful. I like that these guys are all much cheaper than Dragon's Approach. You're going to have 1 mana or 2 mana to spend a lot of the time, so it's important that you have 1 mana, 2 mana spells to cast it on. The 3 mana spell, it's tough for a 3 mana spell to be as good as Dragon's Approach, but I think that the Cannonade gets us there. We're going back to the cheap spells. Lava Dart is really nice. This is, you can cast it once as an instant for 1 mana, deal 1 damage wherever you want. You get that 1 Carah trigger. You can then flash it back basically for free. You sacrifice a mountain, don't have to spend any mana to do that. The thing that makes this very powerful is that this deck is going to run out of mana basically every single turn. You're going to spend all of your mana doing crazy burn stuff, and you're going to be completely tapped out, and you're going to run out of stuff to do. So being able to hit this basically for free without spending mana, to get the card draw off it as well, is very strong. Flame Jab is kind of similar in that it's a 1 mana, 1 damage burn spell, but you can cast it from your graveyard. You just have to discard some lands to it. Discarding lands is not going to be a problem. Carah impulse draws all the cards we want, and she says you can play that card this turn. So some of these impulse draw abilities say you can cast the card, and that means that you cannot play lands because lands aren't cast. But Carah says you may play that card this turn, which means once she's online and working, all of our land drops for our turns are going to come from her impulse draws. We're never going to play lands from our hand again. So being able to do something with the lands in her hand, just chucking the lands in your hand to cast Flame Jab over and over and over again is incredible. This card is a powerhouse. In a deck that's going to have a bunch of burn spells that you cast a bunch of all at once, we would be incredibly remiss if we didn't include a Grape Shot. It is super easy to get your strong count up to 8 or 9, and then just Grape Shot, and like you have 8 or 9 damage to put wherever you want, and every single one of those points of damage that hits a player draws you another card. Honestly, this makes Grape Shot a little bit awkward in the deck because in these Carah chains of burn spells, you can't start with Grape Shot because then there's no storm count and it's very underwhelming. You usually don't want to end with Grape Shot either, because if Grape Shot is the last thing you do and you're completely tapped out on all your mana, you're just wasting like 8 or 9 perfectly good draws with Sir Carah. So you really want Grape Shot to be like right in the middle. You want to be getting 4 or 5 out of it, but you still want to have enough mana left over that you can cast some of those 4 or 5 spells that you hit. The other alternative, and I'll talk more about this a bit later when we see some of these other cards. The other alternative is you can end with Grape Shot if you're going to send all of that damage to creatures. Killing creatures is an important thing that this deck needs to do, and killing creatures doesn't give you the impulse draw. So if you want to end with a Grape Shot and just wipe someone's board, it's not a terrible plan. It's not. I don't think it's the ideal use for Grape Shot in this deck, but it's a good use for Grape Shot. These are the cards that you want to end your Carah chains with. These are our X spells. We have Fireball, it's just X damage to a target. You can get extra targets by paying 1 additional mana for each, and you have to spread that damage evenly. So if you have 6 mana you want to spend in this Fireball, you can 1 to start it, 2 for additional targets. X is 3. That lets you spread 3 damage however you want amongst 3 targets. Or it's not however you want. 3 damage evenly amongst 3 targets. That's 1 damage to everyone, and you impulse draw 3 cards. Rolling Thunder just lets you spread the damage wherever you want without paying. Meteor Shower also lets you spread the damage however you want without paying, but getting really high X values is very expensive because it's XX in the cost. But it does X plus 1 damage. All 3 of these cards are incredibly powerful because of their versatility. You can cast Meteor Shower for 1 mana to deal 1 damage and get 1 impulse draw. This is a good plan in the middle of a Carah chain if you want to keep the chain going. At the end of a Carah chain, you can pour a lot of mana into it and deal a lot of damage to a lot of things. Being able to do both is what makes cards like Meteor Shower really strong. I honestly think Fireball and Rolling Thunder are even stronger than it. They do worse at sort of the low mana values. Like I like Meteor Shower because 1 mana, 1 damage is the floor, and that's a really good floor for cards in this deck. To get 1 damage out of a Fireball, it costs 2 mana. To get 1 damage out of Rolling Thunder, it costs 3 mana. So if you're going to be casting these spells for small values, you're going to pay for it, and it's going to be bad. But you should be able to cast them for big values, and you can hit them in the middle of a chain to draw a lot of cards because they all let you spread the damage around to multiple players. That's all the cards that hit multiple people at once. We're going to move on to talk about my other favorite X spell. This is the start of the cards that hit exactly 1 thing at a time. So each of these cards coming up really only gets you 1 trigger, but it's a very efficient trigger, and we want those. Disintegrate goes with all these other X spells in this pile of really good finishers. It's easy to come up with this Disintegrate while you still have access to like 10 or 11 mana, and just blasting someone in the face for 10 damage is good. That's how you actually close the games with Sir Carah. It will get you there. Unfortunately, it's different than the other X spells. You can't spread it around, but it does have some cool bonuses in terms of things can't be regenerated, and if it would die, it gets exiled instead. So if you have to send one of these at a creature, this one is really good at murking creatures. Lightning Bolt seems like a staple. It only gets 1 target, so it only gets 1 trigger off of Carah, but It's about the most efficient way you can get that target. 1 mana, 3 damage. Chain Lightning, 1 mana, 3 damage. Lava Spike, 1 mana, 3 damage. Skewer the Critics, 1 mana, 3 damage. Galvanic Blast, with as many rocks as we have, Galvanic Blast is basically 1 mana, 4 damage. So these 5 cards right here are all just great ways to spend 1 mana. The mana to damage ratio is incredible. It's very efficient, very powerful, and then you get the card back through Carah. It's a great way to bring your life totals down while still keeping your metaphorical impulse draw hand full. And again, you can send these at creatures if you have to, but they're really good at hitting face. These 2 cards are important because scrying is really good in this deck. I have been playtesting and tuning this deck for a long time, and sometimes you just dead draw. Sometimes you have Carah online and you get like a couple triggers off of a Galvanic Blast or her ability, and a Skewer maybe. You get 3 triggers and like all 3 are lands, and you whiffed. It happens kind of shockingly often. I've tuned the deck a lot to minimize it, but one of the ways that you minimize that is with these scrying cards. The cool thing about scrying is that you do the entire text of the card before you put any of its triggers on the stack. So you'll do the 2 damage, and then you'll scry, and then Sir Carah's trigger happens. So you get the trigger after the scry has done its thing. Aside from that, they're very mana efficient. They're cheap. 1 mana, 2 mana. Again, anything that costs more than 2 mana has to compete with a Dragon's Approach to be good enough to be in the deck, and there kind of aren't cards like that. So scrying is very good. Drawing cards also very good. We're going to deal so much burn to so many things in this deck that like having targets for Needle Drop is going to be very easy, and we'll just deal that 1 damage, and then we get an impulse draw off Carah, and we get a real draw off Needle Drop. Needle Drop is an incredible card for us. Smash to Smithereens is kind of my one piece of utility burn in this deck. Smash to Smithereens will destroy an artifact and then deal 3 damage to its controller. I think that's very good. Sometimes the artifacts are really important. Sometimes it's just 2 mana for 3 damage and an impulse draw. These last 2 are incredible because they are free. Gut Shot you can cast just by spending 2 life and no mana involved. It'll deal 1 damage to whatever you want. This is another great way to just keep these Cherricanes going, rack up the storm count, get a lot of cards seen with her so you can keep the damage output high and get a lot of options. Fire Blast costs 2 mountains. You have to sacrifice 2 mountains to play it, which is a little steep, but oftentimes it is worth it. You're going to have the mountains to spare. Dealing 4 damage for free and getting the impulse draw is almost always worth it. So that is the end of the single target cards. The next category of cards we're going to talk about is an interesting one. Possibly not what you'd expect, but we need to talk about Vigilance. Vigilance is really powerful in this deck because Carah triggers herself every time she does damage. It's not just about dealing damage with these spells. It's about Carah dealing damage. Let me see if I keep... My camera's focus is bad. There you go. Anytime she deals damage, she triggers herself as well. And so normally you have to choose, are you going to deal damage by attacking with her and then you get that 3 damage? Or are you going to deal damage by tapping her for her ability and getting that 1 damage? Typically you only get 1 trigger off of herself each turn. But if you have Vigilance, you get to do both. You get to attack with her. Someone will have an empty board state. She'll get through for 3 damage, and then you can tap her and deal the extra damage as well. And so she's with Vigilance, she's going to trigger herself twice each turn. So every single turn you get your card for turn and 2 Carah triggers. So you get to see 3 new cards every turn, which is very powerful with Vigilance. These 2 will also keep her alive. The thing I really, really love about these 2 is they're free. So one of the things that happens a lot in Sir Carah is sometimes you get these Carah chains where you cast these 3 spells and you deal 3 damage and you get 3 impulse draws and it's just all lands and you whiffed, and that feels bad. What feels worse is when you have 1 mana left and you hit 3 Carah impulse draws and it's a bunch of spells that all cost 2 or 3 mana. And you can't cast them and they stay exiled forever. That feels terrible. These cards cost 0 mana. You're never going to lose them to accidentally hitting the Carah impulse draw while you don't have the mana left. And this only costs 1. They have high equip costs, which is fine. We can plan the equipped costs into the Carah turn before the Carah chain even starts. We can make that a part of the plan. We're just not going to lose the card entirely to a bad Carah draw, which is nice. Next, we need to talk about a couple damage boosters. We're going to be casting spells so often that these 3 cards become unreasonably strong powerhouses. Essentially, all 3 of these cards are going to deal 1 damage to each opponent every time I cast a spell, which is going to get out of hand really fast because this deck, again, I was talking about with Grape Shot, you can very easily get up to storm counts of 8, 9. It can happen, and then these are going to deal 8 or 9 damage to each opponent on those turns. That's even if you hit a storm count of 6 with these guys, you've just dealt 18 damage to the table, which is crazy in a burn deck. The other card that triggers when you cast a spell is Burning Prophet. I already talked about how incredibly important scrying is. Being able to scry every time you cast a burn spell, so you always get a chance to look and see, is this going to help the Carah chain? And if not, you can tuck it, just get rid of it. Burning Prophet is incredible. All 4 of these cards are just unreasonably powerful in this deck. The rest of the entire deck is mana. And there's some interesting things to talk about in this mana pile, so we're going to talk about it, but that's it. This is all of the burn, all of the dragons, all of the utility. Literally everything else is just mana. So we need to talk about these 3 mana guys right here. We got the Lotus Pedal. This is just free. If you hit this in the middle of a Carah chain, you get to cast it for free, and then you have an extra mana that turn. Or if you don't need the mana that turn, you have it for next turn. Usually, I don't like Lotus Pedal in Pauper EDH. It's spending an entire card to get this little treasure effect is almost never worth it. In this deck, is absolutely worth it. We are going to be hitting Carah chains where we're going to run out of mana and we're going to lose cards that we couldn't cast, and they'll just be gone. This will never be one of those cards, and it'll help us make sure that we don't hit good cards when that happens. These are sometimes a little more difficult to cast. Like, you don't want to be in a situation where you hit the Carah chain and you have 4 mana left and you rip a mana geyser off the top. That just feels bad. You've lost your mana geyser. If you can get these into your hand and plan them into like the start of a Carah chain, or if you just hit them really early in the Carah chain and you have the mana for them, these will they will do impossible, absurd things for your Carah chain. They're just so powerful in terms of the mana production. I used to run more in this deck. I used to have stuff like Desperate Ritual and Pyretic Ritual, but they're very inefficient. Lotus Pedal is 1 card for 1 mana because it's free. You'll never lose it to a Carah chain. But like, spending 2 mana for 3 mana is a bad rate for this deck. It just didn't work out like I wanted it to. So Seething Song is 5 for 3. That gives you an increase of 2. That's definitely worth it there. Mana Geyser is I don't know, it's probably like a 12 for 5. So it's harder to cast, but the benefits of Mana Geysering are pretty crazy. Next, we have the consistent mana sources. I think of Wayfarer's Bauble as a rock. I think of Soulbright Flamekin as a rock. Iron Mirror I think of as a rock. Honestly, I probably should have replaced Iron Mirror with Ornithopter of Paradise so that I don't kill my own Iron Mirror with Reign of Embers, but I kind of just really like the Ember Mirror. He's a cutie. So this is the start of my Mana Rock pile. Soulbright is actually extra good. We will we will have 6 mana to spend. So as a rock, he's gonna very consistently generate 2 mana for us. He's pretty much always +2, because you can spend 6 mana to give yourself 8 red. He filters all of our colorless into red, and we are going to have a handful of cards that tap for colorless. These are coming up. We'll see more of these later. Orazka Relic taps for colorless. So we have a lot of rocks that tap for colorless. Sometimes we really need that to be red, and he will filter it into red for us. And he can give Sir Carah trample. If you really need to connect with Sir Carah to get that extra trigger, someone has a stupid chump blocker that they're going to throw it away, you can just give Carah trample, and then you're doing great. Soulbright checks all of the boxes that we want. This card is fantastic. I'm going to leave the Wayfarer's Bauble aside because I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Here are some basic standard issue rocks. We have Arcane Signet, we have Mind Stone. I shouldn't be embarrassed by this because I've already shown you my unsleeved Chain Lightning and my unsleeved Lotus Pedal, but here's an unsleeved Felwar Stone from the Dark. I promise that I had already shuffled and bridge shuffled it and ruined it long before it became worth anything. If that makes you feel better. I don't know if it does. Guardian Idol is the other 2 mana rock. It's sometimes really useful to have a rock that can turn itself into a creature and back off, so you're not going to lose it to board wipes, but you can still have it as an emergency blocker if things get dicey. For the 3 mana rocks, we have Commander Sphere, Orazka Relic. Sometimes you're going to need to sack these for cards, and that's fine. Sir Carah, if you have bad luck with your impulse draws, Sir Carah will run out of gas. Being able to scrap these for cards will help us out. Honored Heirloom is just kind of going in all the decks now. It's just a 3 mana rock that can muddle up graveyard strategies pretty effectively. I don't know if I'm ever actually going to use it. Again, this deck is going to use all of its mana all the time, but maybe sometimes it'll be useful. These are the big rocks. They cost 4, they tap for 2. They come in untapped. That's very, very good. For the first couple Carah chains you pull off, they're going to be really small little Carah chains, and you probably want to end them with just playing a lot of rocks. So you can like pay 4 mana for the Urgolem's Eye and then tap it for the Guardian Idol, and then next turn that's 3 more mana that you have that you wouldn't have. Ending the Carah chain with rocks is probably a better plan than ending it with more burn, because if you end it with more burn at people's faces, you're going to lose the impulse draws you get from that burn. So you got to find other ways to wrap those up, and these rocks are incredible at doing that. Everflowing Chalice is just the biggest rock there is. It is not impossible or unreasonable for it to be a 6 mana rock that taps for 3 in this deck. It's also sometimes just a 2 mana rock that taps for 1. Sometimes it's a 0 mana rock that taps for nothing if you need to jack up your storm count. So there's nothing wrong with that. That's the last of the rocks. Let's look at some lands. We have all 3 of the cycling lands. As I said, once we get Carah online, we're going to only ever play lands from her impulse draws. The lands in our hands, we need to be able to do something with them. Cycling them is great. These are just very good cards for us to have access to. Here's where things are going to get a little weird. I run Terramorphic and E-Wilds and all 3 red Panoramas in my mono red deck alongside Wayfarer's Bauble. Let's talk about why that is. I believe in deck thinning for this deck. I do not believe in deck thinning for most decks. I think that most monocolored decks, the enters play tapped effect of E-Wilds is an incredibly steep price to pay for the deck, for taking a single land out of your deck and having that little bit of deck thinning. But when I play Sir Carah, if Sir Carah goes online, I'm routinely burning through 80% of my deck. And I only have, 20 cards left by the end of the game. And making sure that I'm not minimizing the odds of me hitting 3 Carah draws and getting all 3 lands is very important to me. I think that these lands are absolutely worth it in the deck. These three, the cost of these three is really, really low, actually, the opportunity cost, because they come in untapped and they tap for colorless mana. So you don't have to sacrifice them unless you like really want to. If you want to hit that deck thinning, you can. I think that it's kind of it's not a powerful effect. I think it is a worthwhile effect to have in this deck. The other thing to keep in mind about these lands is that when you do get your Sir Carah turns, so early game, them coming into play tapped is going to change nothing. This deck doesn't do things in the early game. It just accumulates a mana base, plays some rocks. You're not going to be trying to maximize your mana output in the first few turns. The deck really only goes online once Sir Carah is in play in the late game. And once Sir Carah is online, every time you have your turn, you're going to have the choice between like 6 different lands for your land drop per turn. So you'll have some lands in your hand. You'll see a lot of lands through Sir Carah's impulse draws. You'll have the choice of whether or not you think the Terramorphic is going to be good for you, or if you want to let it stay exiled from the impulse draw and play a mountain instead. If you need the untapped land, the mountain will be there. If you want to do the deck thinning, the Terramorphic will be there. You're going to have those options. So the opportunity cost of running 5 fetches in a monocolor deck is actually extremely mitigated in this deck in particular, which I'm pretty proud of. The other reason that we run all 5 of these is your favorite neighborhood scarecrow, the Scaretiller himself. This card is an unstoppable powerhouse in this deck. Partly because we have all the fetches and just being able to fetch every single turn off a Terramorphic as an extra land. That's going to keep us. That's what's going to get us up to 10, 15 mana on board, so that when we hit the Fireball or the Disintegrate or even the Furnace Whelp, that dragon guy that fire breathes, when we hit those, it's going to be super deadly. So Scaretiller is really good at doing that. Scaretiller, even if you don't have any of these fetches around, the other thing that Scaretiller does really, really well in this deck is, I mentioned that all of our land drops for the turn are going to come from Sir Carah's impulse draws once Sir Carah goes online, which means you're going to be accumulating lands in your hand. If you have the cycle lands, you can cycle those, that's great. If you have the Flame Jab, you can discard those lands to retrace, that's great. If you don't have cycle lands or Flame Jab, you need to have something to do with the lands that are going to pile up in your hand, and Scaretiller can put them into play tapped. Like, I always forget about this. Scaretiller, I always think of it as the card that puts lands into play from your graveyard, and it does do that. But it also puts lands into play from your hand if you want it to, which is just extra bonkers in a deck like this that's going to slowly accumulate land in his hands. So Scaretiller is somehow secretly the MVP of the whole deck. The rest is just mountains. Most of them are basic mountains. Dwarven Mine, non-basic mountain. We have that here. That's going to get us a little dwarf. I keep the dwarf stashed right behind Sir Carah. There's the dwarf. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked the deck. I hope you try it out. It is unreasonable amounts of fun. And we'll see you next time.